Okay. Hello, I'm Dr. Naomi Foyle, reader in critical imaginative writing here at the University of Chichester. And on behalf of the Chichester Centre for Fairy Tales, Fantasy and Speculative Fiction, I'm very pleased to invite you to this talk, Tales for Fairies, Tracing Queer Fairy Tale Retellings by Alba Morollón Díaz-Faes. Alba is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Faculty of Social and Human Sciences at the Nova University of Lisbon, Portugal. She has been a visiting scholar at Brown University and Wayne State University. Her work lies at the intersection of fairy tales, queer studies, cultural studies, and contemporary literature in English. Her new book, which she is here to talk about today, Tales for Fairies, Tracing Queer Fairy Tale Retellings, is a groundbreaking exploration of how classic fairy tales have been transformed to illuminate and celebrate queer identities. It is part of the Donald Hauser series in Fairy Tale Studies, Tales for Fairies, edited by Anne Duggan, who is here today, I think, and Donald too. So wonderful. A big welcome to Alba.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that presentation. And hello, everyone. As I was saying right before, I can't see any of you, so I just hope that you're there and that you can follow along. So yes, as I was saying, my name is Alba, and I'm going to be talking about my book today, which recently came out. So okay, just to start with, I'd like to go over something that I think for those of you who work with fairy tales is a very common thing. It's something that you'll be very familiar with, which is what are fairy tales even, or like what are the misconceptions around the genre. So when most people think about fairy tales today, they tend to imagine a fairly recognizable picture, right? So like stories about princes and princesses, perhaps witches and ogres and other kinds of villains. And at the end, there's most likely a heterosexual wedding and a restoration of social harmony. So, what these kind of constructs is a conservative narrative in which, at the end, everything is kind of right again, even if what comes before is, threatens the right order of things. Um, and they tend to be perceived as morally clear. Some of them even have actual morals. And I guess all of these constructs or this idea that it is an ideologically stable narrative, and also that it is timeless and innocent. But if we look more closely at the history of the genre, we find something much weirder. So fairy tales are full of transformations between humans and animals and back. So of course, full of unstable bodies and also strange desires. So fairy tales produce worlds where the boundaries between categories constantly collapse. And humans become animals, animals become lovers, and what it means to become a human, even or grow into a person, is repeatedly disrupted. So, one of the starting points of my book is this: fairy tales have never been as normative or as stable as we tend to imagine nowadays. And this leads me directly to the book's initial argument, which is that in my experience, there is a common way of thinking about queer retellings of fairy tales. Um, I- so they are usually perceived as modern interventions into a straightforward genre. So in this version of the story, the tradition is conservative, and queer writers or queer creators or people who want to engage with the fairy tale queerly come along later and disrupt it. But what I found in my research is that more that out of a rupture, queer fairy tale retelling seemed to grow out of tensions that were already there. And the fairy tale has always been, fascinated, as I mentioned, with transformation, with instability, the breaking of boundaries. And so queer retellings take those existing elements and make them more visible, sometimes with explicit political intent, as we'll see. So to explore that idea, the book looks at fairy tales across history, and in four historical moments, more or less, which is how I'm going to structure today's talk as well. So first, I'll talk about early literary fairy tales, where we already encounter bodies and desires that don't fit neatly within normative categories. And then we'll move on to the 1990s, where we find the first collections for gay readers, so gay retellings of fairy tales. And these come out in the aftermath of the AIDS crisis, or the worst years of the AIDS crisis, which will be significant, as I'll explain in a bit. And after that, we'll move on to the 21st century and the retellings of that period. So after the forced visibility that the AIDS crisis granted queer people, we start seeing queer heroes, even in fairy tales. But these heroes are not perfectly normative, let's say. They still have interesting echoes of monstrosity. And finally, I'd like to talk about queer online fairy tales that are also part of the 21st century retellings, of course, but like they tend to crop up more in the 2010s. And they have a very distinctive parodic contestation style. And the ones I'm going to talk about, they remix the genre in direct response to Disney's enormous influence. So across all of these four moments, what we see is that fairy tales behave less like fixed stories and more like living systems. So they circulate and change as different communities retell them. Oh, I think I'm missing one. Well, never mind. So I'm going to go straight into this. This is this first section on early literary fairy tales. So this section will look at two writers. It will look at Straparola first, writing in 16th century Italy, and then I'll move on to D'Aulnoy, writing in 17th century France. And together they will give us a picture of the genre that was from the very earliest literary forms, preoccupied with unstable bodies, with fluid identities, and also desires that don't fit within normative categories. So the first one, the first case study is The Big Prince, which is an interesting story. Basically, some of you might be familiar with this already. It's a bridegroom tale, but I think it's worth reminding everyone of what it is about. So the royal couple in this story are unable to have children. So eventually the queen goes to the fairies. The fairies grant her a wish, and so she gives birth to a child. But the child is born as a pig. And they accept him. He grows up in the royal palace, but he's still very much a pig. He can talk and everything, but he loves the mud, and he is, I guess, a bit gross to a lot of people. But as he grows older, he starts demanding a human wife. So his royal parents go out and find him a wife. They get married, but during the wedding night, the pig overhears the wife plotting to kill him because she is horrified that he's a pig. And instead of letting her do that, he goes ahead and kills her with his hooves. And of course, since this is a fairy tale, the royal parents go back to the same poor family and they ask for the second sister's hand in marriage. And they comply. The second sister also marries the pig. And again, she's horrified by his piggish disposition. And she plots to kill him, but instead he kills her. And eventually there's a third sister, of course, and they get married, and this third sister is not horrified at all. In fact, when they get married and during the wedding night, she caresses the pig. She is it is implied very excited to be with him, and it is also implied that they have sex. So once this is over, the pig's skin falls away, and he is revealed as this beautiful prince. So even in this very brief outline, the story shows that fairy tales can be quite strange. So the central romantic relationship is between several women and an animal. Marriage involves bestiality and serial murder. And the prince only becomes a man after his animal form has been accepted. So stories like this blur the boundaries between human and animal, attraction, repulsion, and also complicate normative ways of becoming. Um, and animal bridegroom tales like this one already operate through um, forms of instability that will prove to be very productive for later queer retellings. All right. And beyond animal bridegroom stories, there's another tale type that was very popular at the time and for centuries after, that does something interesting with gender as well. So these are cross-dressing maiden night tales. So Daunois wrote Belle Belle or The Night Fortunée in the 17th century, and it is a particularly rich example of how early fairy tales can unsettle normative gender and desire. So Belle Belle disguises herself as a man to answer the king and go to his palace instead of her elderly father. And with the help of a fairy, she becomes the Knight Fortuné. And he now Fortuné, he is welcomed at court as an exemplary knight. So he's brave, he's elegant, he is very convincing in his masculine role. He is very beautiful as well. So the story is interesting because it doesn't present gender as fixed. Belle Belle doesn't just hide in a male, costume, but rather she is successfully inhabiting masculinity and is treated by everyone as a man. In fact, she's not only like good at being a man, she's the best one at court. She's the most like the best looking, the best knight, etc. So she's exceptionally good. But what makes the tale more striking is the desires that it generates around this disguise. Because for Fortuné, while he is wearing male clothing, he is referred to as a he. So all the women at court are obsessed with him, including the queen. The queen falls in love with him. But the most emotionally charged bond is with the king himself. And while in disguise, this produces a very interesting queer narrative space in which the the knight Fortuné longs for the queen for the king, and as a gay man would. Um, and anyway, like it also in this space, gender identity, expression, and desire clearly don't align according to cis heteronormative expectations. And at the very end, Belle Belle's identity is revealed. All of this is kind of like straightened out. The queen is killed. I mean, fairy tale logic, of course. Order is restored. Belle Belle marries the king. But that ending does not erase what comes before. So this sustained exploration of fluid gender and same-sex desire at the level of appearance and social recognition, of course, is very significant. All right. So taken together, stories like The Pig King and Belle Belle show that fairy tales have always been fascinated with boundary crossing and non-normative ways of being and becoming. So characters change bodies, they shift identities, they move across social roles, and so on. And these narrative patterns create a genre that is inherently open to explicit queer interventions later on. So, in my opinion, queer fairy tales or contemporary queer fairy tales don't appear out of nowhere. They emerge from a genre that has long invited ambiguity and the collapse of normative boundaries. And with this in mind, I think we can now jump forward a few centuries and talk about the 90s and the gay fairy tales of this period. So this is the period in time in which gay retellings, and I mean retellings for gay men specifically, first appear in English. And the key figures here are Pizza Castorali and Michael Ford, and they both write collections or anthologies, and these are very significant because, as I mentioned, they emerged right after the worst years of the AIDS crisis. And to understand why these texts appear when they do, uh, we need to go over the historical context a little bit. So the early 90s come directly after the most devastating years of the AIDS crisis, when gay communities in everywhere, but in the United States specifically, where these texts are published, had experienced enormous loss. So during this period, queer cultural production often turned towards storytelling, memory, and also narrative community building as ways to respond to trauma and imagine the possibility of survival. So within that context, fairy tales offered something particularly powerful because these are stories that many people first encounter in childhood. Um, and they are deeply embedded in cultural memory for a lot of us. And importantly, they are built around aspirational narratives of transformation. So for queer writers in the 1990s, retelling them meant reclaiming a narrative space that had historically excluded queer people at a moment of particular need for narrative reconstruction. So Casciarelli and Ford represent the first attempts to consciously do exactly this, to say that, you know, gay readers deserve fairy tales as well. And pretty much like the 19th century folklorists like the Grimms, for instance, who were using fairy tales to construct a national identity. These writers use the genre to imagine a shared cultural world for gay men. So the stories they produce are stories of reparative transformation, of endurance, and even happiness. So I think a good example of how this works in practice is Casciarelli's Rumpelstiltskin, which is a retelling of that tale. And in this version, a protagonist called Stephen is helped by the imp to win the love of a prince. But the bargain is that this happiness will be taken away from him in a year. So when the imp returns, he tells Stephen that he is HIV positive. The fairy tale bargain is rewritten in terms of queer vulnerability in the age of AIDS. And what is at stake is not a child, but happiness, love, and of course, the possibility of a future. So the most important part of the story, which is of course the riddle, comes after. And so over the next 3 nights, Stephen must guess why he is positive. Each wrong answer actually is repeating the moralizing and homophobic narratives that circulated at the time around HIV and AIDS. So it says things like it's God's punishment, gay sex equals death, or that queerness is somehow to blame. But at the end, he finds the right answer, which is that this is simply a virus that he was exposed to, like a horrible virus, but just a virus. And so what the tale is doing is using this structure of the tale to dismantle shame and replace it with a more empowering understanding of the illness. Interestingly, it doesn't imagine a cure. It doesn't go that far. And this is kind of pretty common among the tales or the retellings of this period. There's no magical cure for AIDS or HIV, which is pretty sad, but understandable as well. Like they don't go there, but they do imagine ways in which they can survive somehow with it, and also in which they still have like a livable future with some dignity. So in this sense, the fairy tale becomes a space for rebuilding community. And these collections reclaim the genre for gay readers. And so it's not just entertainment, it's a form of cultural repair and also of community rebuilding after the worst years of the crisis. And this moment marks an important turning point because from here onwards, queer fairy tales begin to move into mainstream cultural spaces. So again, because they were, this is the forced visibility of AIDS, it forced queer people into the mainstream. And so it also happened in queer retellings. So queer characters begin to appear not only as outsiders or victims, but increasingly as protagonists or heroes. So this brings us to the third moment, which is the early 21st century, when queer retellings begin to circulate through mainstream and mainstream adjacent media. So comic books, graphic novels, even TV shows, also more genre, fantasy series, this type of thing. And in this period, queer characters are increasingly allowed to occupy central narrative positions, but they don't simply step into uncomplicated heroic roles. Retellings from this period often internalize the old fairy tale tension between hero and monster, but they do so within the protagonist's own body. So what they produce is not a pure hero replacing the queer monster, but a monstrous hero or a heroic monster, I guess. And the example that I wanted to discuss is The Hidden Kingdom, which is a spin-off of the Fable series. So, and this series by Willingham is a series built around displaced fairy tale characters who have been expelled from their homelands and now live in Fabletown in New York. So that structure of exile already matters because it frames fairy tale identity itself as unstable and migratory. But in the Hidden Kingdom, Rapunzel is the main character, but she's no longer the passive girl in the tower. She basically travels, the beginning of the story is she's traveling back to the Japanese Celestial Palace, which is the Japanese equivalent to Fabletown. So this is where Japanese fables live, but they are essentially darker creatures. They are yokai, ghosts, demons, and the like. And as the narrative unfolds, we learn of an earlier trauma because this is not the first time that she's been there. She was there centuries ago, and she was thrown into a well with corpses and left there to die. So from that point onwards, the comic rewrites Rapunzel through horror imagery. And basically, she eats her own hair to survive and gives birth to murderous children. So these are sentient bezoars who go on a killing spree. And she is visually reimagined through this explicit reference to The Ring, Ringo, the Japanese film, or the American one, The Ring, in which a girl, for those of you who don't know, a girl is thrown into a well, she dies, then she becomes this vengeful spirit who climbs out of a well, and there's a video of it, and whoever sees it will die in 7 days. Well, anyway, this was very big at the beginning of the 21st century. But so for me, this is an obvious reference. But yeah, so this is an interesting mix of Rapunzel and Sadako here. And she is otherwise, Rapunzel is very much a princess character. Like she is very beautiful in this series. So it is very interesting how she is allowed to be this monstrous in this particular case. And crucially, this monstrous turn is also what enables her to explore her queerness in a way, because in the Celestial Palace, she falls in love with Tomoko, who is a shape-shifting kitsune, so a kind of fox-like creature who kills or eats men. But this only happens within the context of the Celestial Palace. So the comic ties queer desire not to everyday life, but to a dark and exoticized elsewhere that stands in contrast with the more normative Fabletown. And that's what makes this example useful in my eyes, because it captures some of the tensions of this period. So in 2011, critic Sam Miller wrote, "There are no more queer monsters." So he meant that the fight for positive representation of queer people and queer characters had defanged the traditional queer monster. So queerness had been normalized, and as such, he was no longer frightening. So for him, losing the frightening queer was not just a cultural shift, it was also a political loss. Um, and that debate sits right at the heart of this chapter and this period, because fairy tales have popularly being understood as presenting a stark opposition between heroes and monsters. In the popular imagination, heroes are normative, and the queerest characters in popular culture, like Disney films, etc., they are consistently the villains. So gender nonconformity signals monstrosity, signals villainy. But these retellings refuse that binary. And Jeffrey Cohen argues that the monster simultaneously repels and attracts. So we distrust it, but we also envy its freedom. So for many queer people, the monster is a source of dissident pleasure, precisely because it refuses domestication, because it carries what the hero had to surrender in order to be acceptable. So the fairy tale, because it's so strange and it has this deep allegiance to dark desires, remains an interestingly fertile site for this figure of the queer monster. And these retellings don't eradicate the queer monster, they give it the protagonist role in a way. So again, it's not a pure queer hero replacing the queer monster, but both held together. And for the final part of the talk, I want to move into the 2010s, and specifically to digital culture, because of course there's some overlap between the previous wave of queer retellings and this one. But the 2010s is when queer fairy tales begin to circulate through platforms like YouTube, and also Tumblr and Instagram and so on. But I'm going to be focusing on YouTube today, because this is where parody music, performance, and um, rapid sharing become central to the genre. So by this point, queer visibility had expanded significantly, but it is also filtered through algorithms and platform economies. So, and importantly, as I mentioned, Disney has become the dominant public language of the fairy tale. So Disney pretty much is the thing that defines what a fairy tale is for many people. So queer digital retellings of this time respond to this situation by working from inside Disney's own visual and narrative ecosystem. So they parody it rather than leave it behind. And the example I'm using here is Todrick Hall's Cinderfella. This is a YouTube musical parody from 2012 that turns Cinderella into an openly queer, explicitly pro-marriage equality fairy tale. So this is the most explicitly political example I'm going to cover today. So Hall places himself at the center of this retelling as a male Cinderella, and he uses the piece as a form of online activism designed to travel through peer-to-peer sharing beyond the queer and Black counterpublics it's emerging from and into the mainstream. And I was around when this happened, when this came out, and it very much entered the mainstream. I remember how it was reported in mainstream media, not only in gay news outlets. And it was very interesting to see. Of course, this is the product of a particular time when marriage equality was not a thing yet in the US, for instance. So there was a big push for that. And of course, politically and culturally, very different from where we are at right now. But so it was very successful in going beyond the queer and Black counterpublics that it emerged from. And what made the parody work, and what makes it a bit complicated as well, is the particular combination of strategies it deploys. So Hall keeps the glitter, the spectacle, and the romance of the Disney-fied fairy tale completely intact, but it also layers it with pop mashups, drag performances, and many other queer references. And all of this expose the seams of what appears natural in Disney's versions. So through campy excess, Hall draws attention to the fact that Cinderella's transformation was always already drag. It's a performance of hyperfemininity achieved through costume and gendered performance. And in this case, but also in a lot of other queer retellings that I've worked with, is very interesting because there is a clear connection between the fairy godmother and the drag mother, which makes sense, of course, but this is very interesting to see how like this connection is made repeatedly. This older woman who coaches a younger girl, gives her a name sometimes, trains her in the ways of hyperfemininity and femininity in general, and like gendered performance. So yeah, interesting commonality. And the video closes with Cinderella saying that, oh no, he actually stays at the ball. He doesn't leave, and he refuses to leave, in fact. And the screen reads, "It is time, legalize love." So the goal of the parody becomes openly political at this point, and also assimilationist. So that tension between camp subversion and normative desire, between the queer counterpublic style of contestation and this mainstream aspiration of equality, is precisely what defines this moment. All right, so what do all of these moments taken together show us? So I think that each historical moment produces a queer fairy tale that responds to the socio-political tensions of its time. And of course, those tales tell us a lot about their historical present, but also about the genre's past. And what I try to offer here, of course, is just a series of snapshots. It's not a comprehensive history, but together I hope they show that queer fairy tales don't emerge in isolation, and that the genre itself has always been more open and stranger than the popular image suggests. And my book, specifically Tales for Fairies, is meant as an initial step in questioning the heterosexual alibi of the fairy tale. So this persistent assumption that this is a naturally, timelessly, or innocently straightforward genre. What I would like to is to invite everyone to ask what becomes possible once we stop taking the heterosexuality of the fairy tale for granted. And I hope this book can be read as the beginning of that road rather than the end of it. Okay, thank you so much. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Oh, God.
Thank you so much, Alba. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure it's going to spark so many questions. You covered so much ground there. We've got all of these scholars in the audience with all of their specialisms already kind of piling in, I can see on the chat. Heather, would you like me to read questions out from the chat, or would people like to put their hands up? Is there any?
I guess we could do both, because Aiku's put something in.
Let's have a look at the chat and see.
Hall's various retellings of the fairy tales are dragged in a way that turns the queer into gothic queer. It's not. I didn't think of his artwork as a retelling of fairy tales in this perspective. A nice example and connection. And then A says the gender performance from the fairy godmother reminds me of a Traveller version, where the godmother coaches her in how to perform class rather than gender. So the class gender exploration within drag is fascinating. So that was really interesting comments, but not questions. Sorry, Naomi.
That's okay. Did you want to respond to either of those comments, Alba?
Yeah, let me just read.
So the relationship between class and gender in one.
And that's very interesting. and I haven't thought of that, but like, of course, there is an element of class performance in drag as well, which ties back to ballroom kind of culture, and so there's a performance of excess as well, of like of wealth that is built into it, and this is very interesting and an interesting angle that I haven't thought about. So yeah, this is great. Thank you so much.
And then I think there might have been a question earlier. So Alice Fanny Marchese has said in the version by Murat of the same tale, which tale? Sorry, it wasn't the picking. Yes, maybe if you'd like to ask that, I would ask it much better than I do.
Thank you so much for this wonderful. I can't wait to read the book. I was wondering, you bring up the Belle Belle cross-dressing fairy tale, which uses at some point a fairy to sort of like anoint and help the passing of the character from female to male. And there's a version by Murat called The Wild Man or Le Sauvage, where there is no magic helper, and actually it's just her sister kind of helping her go through the world and passing. And I was wondering if in the other tales that you bring forth and beautifully discuss, the importance of magic to help curtail and constantly show the reader that we are not in the real world, in your relationship and your understanding of what the marvelous brings to these exploration of non-heterosexuality and non-cisgenderness.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I was trying to remember other like cross-dressing maiden knight tales in which I don't think there's always a magic helper. I see Anne is nodding along, so I guess this is correct. Because I was trying to remember this. And also, like, well, whether magic is necessary or not, that goes down to the question of what makes a fairy tale, right? Like, I don't know. So I don't. So again, like, if there's no magic at all, is it a fairy tale? Like, I think that's one of the genre's biggest questions, right? Like, what is it that defines the fairy tale? So I don't know if it has so much to do with the transformation from one gender to another, or and more of a generic thing, because of course there are a lot of, outside of the fairy tale, at the time there were plenty of stories of cross-dressers, so similar ones. This all are contaminated by all of these other literary traditions, right, and examples in the genre. But like, yeah, I tend to think of fairy tales as containing some sort of marvelous element, and as transformations, like these transformations for me do have some sort of like magical element to them of some kind. Yeah, and would you like to add to this?
Well, I could add to it, and then I mean, actually, as you guys are talking about this, it was just making me think that even if there isn't magic, the genre itself offers that flexibility, that speculative space to imagine alternative identities, even if magic isn't involved. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But like, there's, even if it's not magic, there's an element of strangeness, right? Like something odd. So I don't know if Teresa, in your example, like it's something that really has no magic at all, or if it's just magic is not involved in the transformation itself.
And maybe just a bigger, I guess I've just really enjoyed your work on this book, and how it kind of traces this history going from the 90s to the 2000s and the 2010s. And I think what you were talking about today, this whole idea of, I really liked the parallel you made between Grimm's constructing a collective identity through the tales, and how gay writers in the 1990s were using this to build a collective identity in a similar situation of disarray of the community that these are restorative. Because I think like some of the things you're saying also speak to why is the fairy tale important, because we get those questions all the time, and so I don't know if you want to speak more to that, but I think it's a really interesting study showing it's both theoretical, but then there's this history behind it. And then I really like the way you talk about this idea of community, and what the fairy tale is doing in that parallel with the Grimms. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yes, actually, to me, this is one of when I was writing it the first time around during my PhD and so on. Like this was one of the wildest claims, because it felt like such an exaggeration to say that. Because I didn't go into a lot of this, but like the tales from the 90s, they are very campy. They are not like the most serious like engagements with the fairy tale genre. And also there are like just a few examples, like they're just like I say, oh yeah, this is where they all appeared, but like there's like 6 of them, so it's not that many, of course, but it is a significant beginning. But like the truth is that they do the same thing. Like they are bringing together this kind of an imagined community of readers, kind of, and constructing something they can refer back to, that they can sort of construct, as you say, in a moment of turmoil and like of fragmentation of the community. They are sort of constructing a common narrative that they can go back to. And when it comes to the gay retellings of the 90s, they are also trying to address a community that is ravaged by this disease, but also by all these other narratives that are so negative about them. So there's like an element of reparative therapy through fairy tales almost.
There's some more questions in the chat. Here's one from Ace. How do you think gender norms and expectations from other cultures have affected or not the queering of Western fairy tales? For example, deities moving between genders in Indian stories and shapeshifters in Native American stories.
That's a very good question. To be fair, like when I was writing this, I focused specifically on retellings of Western European canonical tales. So like I had to narrow it down a lot. So I read a lot of tales that were more inspired by other cultures and that like explore the queer aspects of those tales, and those were very interesting, but it was just like completely outside of the scope, because otherwise I would have never finished. And I think there is influence. It's just difficult to spot, because like I wouldn't be able to say. But for instance, like in an interesting example is Kasharali. Kasharali, he wrote the Rumpelstiltskin retelling I mentioned. He, even though the tales are, as I said, kind of campy, he actually has this more folkloristic or academic part to his collections, where he cross-references the tales that he is retelling. So, but not only one, but different versions as well. So like he brings in or he mentions tales from other traditions, not only the Western European tradition. I don't necessarily see the impact of those other tales in his particular retelling, but like he is making those connections. So clearly he's read them or he's aware of them. So potentially he's bringing in some influence from them, even if it sticks rather close to the Western European tale that he's retelling.
Maybe they have kind of a permissive effect, an encouraging effect. I don't know, Ace, did you want to come in? Maybe you have some knowledge here about some particular lines of influence.
Oh, I don't know specifically. I
I am aware of, like, where I've been collecting stories, that you hear things that ring in the same way, and it's like, oh, I would love to learn more about, I guess, sort of how these stories have migrated from different places, and has a story that started in one place come through via trade routes and you know, kept some elements but picked up like things that fit within the culture that it's now being spoken in, and then that gets moved on somewhere else. And I mean, I imagine that is a much bigger thing to explore, but
Yeah.
it's something that I'm very interested to look at.
Yeah.
I mean, if I could jump in, I think
Yeah.
that mostly happens with like Arabian Nights tales and some of the Oriental tales that come out in the 18th century. I mean, it might come, you know, but I'll stop there because maybe Alba has more to say. But I think the Arabian Nights is one example where that it's coming through, and even tales that had initially been Indian tales are coming to Europe through via the Arabian Nights, which was incredibly popular and impactful on the European literary field. Yeah, so.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I just wanted to say that this is a very interesting line of inquiry. So like, if you would like to explore it, like, be my guest, because that's the thing. Like, for me, I felt with this book, I just could do like only so much, right? And I think there's so much more there that could be done. And so if you're inspired to take this forward, please do, because I think it's necessary.
There is quite a long, Anastasia's written a long comment here. Is there a question in here, Anastasia? Did you want to join in?
Looks like a very interesting idea about a
Yeah.
Grimm's. I don't know what a Kipper-Carton deck is.
Yeah. Okay. So this is about the, sorry, I haven't heard of this figure,
Alaliro,
Alaliro,
I think.
Alaliro from Grimm's. So this is the main character who runs from being forced into a gender role that ignores their unique identity and spends time disguised in the fur of all the animals. So the monstrosity is recoded as a sort of chrysalis from which they can emerge after a period of development. And this is a figure that's appealed strongly to people who don't, quote unquote, fit across time. So maybe there's a little bit more to say here around monstrosity and the ambiguities around tensions around monstrosity and shape-shifting.
Yeah, so this is referencing all kinds of fur. Yeah. So which areas are just idea?
It's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. This is a good point. I think this is the journey of a lot of this kind of like tales, like this kind of protagonists who have like this queer way of becoming or like growing. So basically, instead of going the normative route from childhood to adulthood via marriage and perhaps reproduction and then death, there are like all these arresting or arrested development. So this it's like queer temporalities essentially. So of course, I think this through monstrosity comes like a sort of liberation as well, as I think this is the point, right, of this comment. So yeah, exactly. This is already present in the traditional, so-called traditional tales.
And I suppose there's room here for kind of eco-queer tellings as well now, where people might not want to actually turn back into into a human being, but maybe might just like to remain animal or some hybrid,
Exactly.
some kind of beyond human being. There's a question here from Junior Osterval. It would be interesting to hear you say something about the role of illustration as well, given its importance in the fairy tale genre. Do you have any thoughts on the role of illustration and the visual? Do you see fairy tale illustrators using visual means to represent queerness that might challenge visual logics of gender, sexuality, race, etc.?
Yes, so I'm thinking of the texts that I analyze in my book that are like either illustrated or are graphic novels, or like it's a yeah, anyway, so they have illustrations, and it's interesting because what I found, and these are, I don't have a super big sample, bear in mind, but what I found is that in these tales, and one of them is the Hidden Kingdom, actually, so the one I mentioned, the Fables spin-off. There's a bit of tension between the text and the illustration, and the illustration, in this case, there are like publications for like a more mainstream audience, and the illustration tends to be more normative than the text. So there, for instance, in the Hidden Kingdom, on the back of the book, there's a picture of Rapunzel and Tomoko, her girlfriend, and they are like kind of very provocative, looking at the camera, like their kimono is kind of falling off. It's very straight male gazy, sort of inviting a third to join them. It's just, and there's none of that in the story itself. This is purely to attract readers, right? And a particular kind of reader, I would say. So I don't know if this is answering your question, but like I think this is natural to any kind of illustrated text that is not illustrated by the author. When there are two people working, like there's going to be some tension. And what I found particularly with this more like 21st century texts is that, yeah, the illustration tends to be a bit more normative than the text. But again, small sample.
We've got a comment again from Anastasia, just clarifying around the Kipper carton, which is a fortune-telling card deck like Lenormand or Tarot, but more character-driven. So that sounds interesting. So story-based, character-driven. Was there? Oh, here's a actually, I might wait for yours, Ace, because I think it might be a good one to end on. But I just wondered if you had looked at the Snow Queen at all, because it seemed to me that the little robber girl and Gerda, they have a little bit of a vibe going on, and that might also be related to the questions around class as well.
Yeah, so I don't actually go into it much, but there are some queer retellings of the Snow Queen. I just couldn't fit it in the end.
Yeah.
There were too many things, which is interesting because when I started my research, like I felt I didn't have enough, and then at the end, like there was an explosion really in the past 10 to 15 years, and like then it became impossible to actually have everything in. But yes, that is an obvious one, also because I think in general, Anderson's tales tend to be ripe for queering because he also brings in, his queerness to these tales, and like his otherness, which is both queer and also there's a class element to it. So, so yeah, that's a very interesting one.
Yeah. Okay. And then Ace's question, and if anyone has a question afterwards, we certainly can take more. But this is quite a nice one, projecting forward. From what you've seen in your research, what do you think the future of queering fairy tales might look like?
So that's a great question. And what I saw when I had to stop writing this, what I was seeing is that it precisely was that suddenly there were many, many more queer fairy tales, queer retellings of fairy tales, for all kinds of audiences, also for children. This is something that I haven't mentioned, but it's not, the first queer fairy tales were not for children at all. They were for adults. And in fact, the ones from the 90s, a lot of them are erotic as well. So there was like a hurdle here, like to go over, because queerness is perceived as being for adults, as being, at least historically, has been perceived as being something that is inherently sexual. So as such, not fit for children. And so this took this kind of like retellings for children took much longer. And in fact, well, I mean, if you've followed the whole like Frozen thing, like you know, Frozen 2 was Elsa was not gay, and so on and so forth, even though like people really did try to get her to be gay. So Disney hasn't quite got there yet. So what I think is that, and what I've seen is that you get, even though we're not there yet, like you do see many more retellings for children for all ages, much more variety as well in terms of gender, race, everything, all the categories. And I think a very important thing is that you see many more trans retellings. And this is also something that was missing before. And it's also kind of not strange, because of course it makes sense in terms of like the socio-political everything, but I mean, the fairy tale is perfect for trans stories. Like it is, the transformations are like kind of built into the genre. So it's a perfect marriage. And also considering the very rough political situation now and climate, I think that that's what I expect. I expect contestations to come from trans creators.
Thank you. And that does seem like very possible lines of flight, and we'd be very welcome for people to land and perch here with us at the centre with any more research in this area. So got some lovely comments at the end. Thank you for the great talk. Nimona on Netflix is great for children and young teenagers. People are agreeing with that. More thanks for the talk, learning a lot. I learned a lot, and possibly a new way of looking at fairy tales. But one more question from Alice here. Alice, with your hand up.
Yes, I was wondering if you had an opportunity to interact with something called Dungeons and Dragons, maybe online show like Dropouts, who have done seasons called Never After, which were queer retellings of fairy tales.
I haven't. I've heard of it, but no, I haven't. I haven't watched it.
It just, if you ever have some time, it might be extremely interesting to do some research on this.
Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds, yeah. But see, there's too much now. I can't keep track. But thank you so much. Yes. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alba Díaz-Faes, for coming to join us today and sharing your really quite compelling research, which has got such deep roots, but is flowering in many wonderful places at the moment, and hopefully for a long time to come. And oh, we've got one more question from Teresa. Yeah. Hand up. Did you have your hand up, Teresa? Did you want to?
Okay, again.
Oh, maybe not. Maybe that was a little kind of hand up in by accident. Okay, lovely. So I think we'll wind up now. And oh, hang on. Here's another talk being Heather. Yeah, Heather it's from ourselves. Yeah. Appropriated Tales, Race and the Disney Fairy Tale Mode with Michelle Anya Angebag on Tuesday, the 21st of April this year, 5:30 to 6:30 again. So this is a talk about Disney's storytelling practices, revealing how the corporations influence public understanding of what fairy tales are and who is allowed to appear within them. So we hope we might see you again soon in April.
Thanks so much, everyone. Naomi and Alba. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alba, and thank you, Heather, and everyone
Thank
at
you.
Chichester.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks.